And that's primarily about it. Lastly, just be mindful of equity, no generalizations. If you're giving any triggering content, please give trigger warnings before you start your speech. Cool, with all of that out of the way, I would like to invite the first proposition speaker, here.
Awesome. He, him pronouns, and I prefer POIs verbally, please. You put water into a bottle and it becomes a bottle. Now, water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. It is because we completely agree with the wise words of Bruce Lee that we're so proud to propose. 3 things in my speech today. The first, we're going to frame the debate, and then we're going to bring the first argument on personal fulfillment, and then the second argument on why you get less abuse, and then Sophia will later bring our third argument. So first, let's go on to framing. First, what do we think lying flat looks like? We say that this is a philosophy that likely emerged in China against the hyper-competitive work culture. So lying flat in itself is a societal narrative that counterbalances the existing work culture. This means that you don't try to structurally change people's lives to fit into societal definitions of what's a better life that, for instance, could look like seeking a better job, marriage, or children. This means that you're pursuing things that instead that you like or want to do, or the things that are most accessible to you. However, we would like to note that people will still face certain hardships in life, and thus they will still be able to do things such as A, deal with daily hardships such as xenophobia, the lack of basic necessities. In these cases, people will still go with that, what their natural course of action is, fight back and earn a living. We're just saying that in this world, people are probably not actively looking to advocate for societal beliefs or looking for a better job. And B, probably people are just pursuing natural things that make them happy. But second, what do we think life would be like for those who do lie flat? We'd say that people who probably will still seek fulfillment on either side, which means they aren't pressured to have constantly receive a promotion in a corporate setting and chase societal definitions of success. We just don't dwell on things that we don't control. So for instance, it would probably be like the provert letting life take its course, which means people will pursue things that are important to them intrinsically, and for example, just following your passions. But I would like to note, right? Accepting vicissitudes of life probably means that you're coming to peace with who you are and thus operating under those measures. With that out of the way, go on to our first argument on why lying flat betters personal fulfillment. At top on context, we say that life will be long and painful no matter what. No matter how rich you are or how many family members you have, there are always things that you cannot achieve. For example, a hurricane could hit you and make all of your belongings disappear. You could be fired from a job. You could probably really want a Lamborghini, but you can't afford a Lamborghini. We say that these are things that you can inherently not control. So what do we think people would react to this inside the status quo, which is the comparative on side opposition side? We say that humans will probably always be unhappy due to how much they cannot achieve, which results in things such as people devoting their time into a worthless cause, or people constantly stressing over causes instead of prioritizing their current well-being, which is why exactly you see current societal trends such as worker burnout. But more importantly, on their side, we say that for those who probably don't have to face the threats of worker burnout, they probably also resort to a hyper-consumerist lifestyle, right? This is because the societal narrative being dominated completely by the rich and the wealthy, but also advertisement and malls always telling us that we need to buy as much as possible and consume as much as possible. Now, why do you get more fulfillment on our side? Few things. First, we say you're probably less attached to unstable things. When accepting the premise of lying flat, it means that you're accepting whatever misfortune happens to you and you're not actively trying to change it. On our opponent's side, however, they're actively trying to change things and they'll be very attached to them until they actually achieve something, which we say probably has a low probability in the first place. This then takes away people's ability to do more things and move on. This looks like taking more years off and then suffering from mental breakdowns. But second, this probably also means that people are more able to cope with loss. The most common form of vicissitudes of life is loss and absence of humans, which is something everyone will experience. When this does happen, lying flat means that it is easier for you to deal with the loss of a loved one and be able to cope with it. We remove the greatest harms, for instance, of you trying to, unable to go through the attachments of what you had against this special someone, which probably also means that when humans unfairly get evicted or by the vicissitudes of lives, for example, when their mother passes away, they're much able to move on and then move on with their lives, which is probably the best of both worlds. But thirdly, probably also means that you're spending more time for yourself and what you truly love. This looks like people choosing to maybe take a job that pays less, but then choosing to live in the present and thus being able to spend more time with their family or pursuing other hobbies. This means that then on our side, people are actually given an opportunity to explore their own individuality and their own hobbies. The overall gist is this, right? You don't spend time changing things that cannot be changed. You're much more likely to enjoy your life because you realize now it's actually full of benefits and you can do what you want to do, and you're fully like you're the ruler of your own life. The impact is this. First, we say that on opt, they probably nurture a world where there is a linear definition of success, i.e., that like the idea of success is very defined by convention. You have to be rich, you have to have family. However, life, we say, is probably subjective, and ultimately we don't have to defend things, just the oppression of minorities or how their current situations are net bad, because all things ranges on different types of people. But then we say on our side, the impact is humans don't live objectively better lives, but instead they live individually what they think is the best life. This means they have the time to pursue things such as mental health, family time, and all of this betters someone's mental well-being, which is the most important thing in the round. Because if you're not certain of your own identity, or if you're not in the right headspace, eventually you will burn out and thus not be able to achieve anything. Before I move on to our second argument, I'll take a point. Cool. Our second argument is thus then on why you get less abuse. Few layers here. First, we say that people probably don't force others to change, as lying flat in itself as a philosophy dictates that people will accept who they are, their power, and thus don't tell others who they should be. This results in things such as less societal pressure that forces people to be forced into specific lifestyles or careers, because philosophy pushes natural flow instead of transforming into different lifestyles, right? This probably looks like every year when I go back to Taichung House, my grandma and Chinese relatives are always asking me if I have a girlfriend. If I do choose to lie flat, then in myself and my philosophy is that I don't really need to get a girlfriend right now, and thus I probably live a more carefree life. This applies, I want to know, argument applies to everybody in society and thus is now the norm on our side. But second, why do people treat each other better on our side? We say that on a person-to-person level, people probably have less incentive to inflict harms on each other, because most time people conflict are times where there is a certain something that both party wants. Therefore, if people understand what is theirs will eventually be theirs, there's no reason for them to be all Machiavellian and therefore try to hurt others. On an employee corporation level, because employees buy into the narrative that they must work long hours to achieve fulfillment, is a great example of this. We say that society's narrative of better life is always zero sum, and thus you have a selective amount of time of how you want to conduct people's different relationships and how you overall are presenting your character. This looks like taking someone down or creating abuse as company CEO, or simply just trying to screw over other people that are your colleagues for a better leadership position. But thirdly, when you opt into the idea of lying flat, why is all of this better? We say a few things. People probably no longer have the incentive to inflict harms on each other for their own benefit. They probably feel like their life are more centered on internal growth and stability, thus greater focus, personal happiness, and this all manifests in ways such as producing less goods at the expense of the climate or shutting other people down in order to achieve your own personal growth. For those then who are considered outsiders or unconventional, they probably suffer a lot less stigmatization, because then thus they're able to dictate their own narrative instead of always trying to combat or try to fit in what society's dictate of what normal is. Thus, we say for a lot of people who do not fit into the general gist of society are also partly preserved and in a much better space inside our world. The impact is this: less societal pressure means people are much more comfortable with who they are, but second, also increased cooperations, which then would further translate into increased societal efficiencies, which applies to probably all spheres of society. So if you do also want to focus on the collective, we'd also win on that. In conclusion, be water and vote prop.
Great, thank you for that speech. With that, I would like to call upon the first opposition speaker to open the case from opposition. Here.
Exactly. Take me through as verbally, please. Proposition says individuals still have incentives to deal with basic hardships in their life. And perhaps this is true, they still do basic necessities like get a job. But our stance in opposition is that you're less likely to fight to improve your conditions, which is definitionally true given the model and given the wording of the info slide. And this is important because just because you're resigned to your material conditions, doesn't change the suffering people face when they're unable to improve those material conditions. Or it doesn't change the hunger you feel when you cannot afford food, the pain you feel as a victim of police brutality, or the grief you feel when you cannot afford healthcare for your sick and dying child. These are strong, visceral emotions that cannot be washed away, even if you embrace a philosophy and resign yourself to your circumstances, so it is unlikely you actually get meaningful happiness in proposition. The second thing they say then is that there will always be things that you cannot achieve and that you're going to face burnout under their side, our side of the house. But first, most people eventually learn to regulate their expectations and their emotions. That's because they do not like the feeling of burnout, so they try to find ways to emotionally readjust themselves. And what this means is that even if you do not achieve 100% of the things that you want, you oftentimes find solace in the things that you have achieved along the way. But the difference then is that on their side, you are likely to feel more regret in the long term, where in the future, at the end of your life or in your future, you always look back and you wonder at what could have been. A regret that becomes all-consuming because these are questions that you will never know the answer to, which outweighs the fact that at least you can find some solace in tangible benefits you have achieved. So that's some brief refutation on proposition. There's two arguments I'm going to talk about today that probably outweigh their content anyways. Firstly, I want to talk about why social movements get better under our side of the house when we fix systemic inequality. And note that there are systems of inequality in the world. That doesn't just apply to China because we're just evaluating the philosophy in general, right? Where there's things like historical oppression and slavery in the United States that have perpetuated generational wealth inequalities, where historical redlining has limited the educational opportunities of immigrants, where there's still remnants of apartheid today that precludes the ability of people to access socioeconomic opportunities. Even the caste system in India that leads to systemic oppression of the lower class. I'll take you at the end of this theme. So there's always incentives for certain groups to perpetuate systems of inequality to benefit themselves, but they have the opportunities and privilege to perpetuate this privilege continuously by doing things like lobbying for oppressive policies, etc. How does this change under our side of the house when you don't embrace this idea of lying flat? This is because, trivially, you just don't accept the unfair circumstances in which you were born, where you agitate for change, whether through protests or through other means within a democratic system, or through things like violent revolutions. And you don't get any of this in proposition, because the proposition narrative is one that says, why fight and suffer to change the system? You should just accept the system and live your life. They said it at the end of this theme. So, but know that this has been demonstrably effective, where those that have often faced oppression often do fight back, and this often has shown to be incredibly effective, at least in the long term, where violent revolutions have done things like abolish slavery, like end segregation, like end apartheid. But the crucial thing is, no change ever happens, no matter how slow on proposition, insofar as you resign yourself to your fate and you just choose to deal with the hand that you've been dealt. What is the weighing then of this argument? We can get change for systems as a whole, where perhaps some individuals never see the material benefits of their own efforts, but in the future, newer generations are born into better opportunities, where they no longer have to suffer from problems like hunger or state abuse, where they have the financial freedom to access the passions that are so important to the team of proposition, where they have financial freedom to access these passions, where they can experience more than a bleak resignation and can rather have the opportunities to find joy in pursuing something that makes their life worth living, whether being able to afford like music or afford art supplies, whatever material, whatever passions that they want to pursue, they have the opportunities and the privilege to do so because we fix and rectify systemic inequalities that are never changed in proposition because of complacency. I'll take a POI.
Why wouldn't society push the burden of upliftment on themselves to the poor and also African Americans on your side?
Like just look at the comparative, right? On your side, obviously the rich aren't going to advocate for change, but the difference is the poor also don't advocate for change either because they resign themselves to their fate. The sad reality of the fact is that the people at the top often have no incentives to create change. It has to be the people who experience the lived experience of oppression that create this change. The difference is they're resigned to their fate on your side of the house. You never get systemic change. Second argument then, on individual fulfillment. In the absence of this narrative, people are likely to believe in philosophies that preach agitation and a hope for a better future. But like even if this weren't the case, we think people have a natural biological tendency to feel hope because it motivates us as a survival instinct. So why is hope, which we get on our side of the house, important then? First, we think it improves your material conditions, where even in case of systemic equality, like your individual efforts often do have some change in terms of improving your situations in life. Where if you study hard at school, you get a comparatively better job than if you just failed at other classes. If you go and ask for promotions instead of waiting for them to fall into your lap, this still increases your chance of getting promoted compared to not doing so at all. And note that this is important because improving your material conditions is a prerequisite to accessing any other benefits because it protects your basic rights to life and security. It gives you access to food and shelter and these sorts of things that allow you to access the things like passions that the proposition wants to talk about. But secondly, hope is intrinsically beneficial because it acts as a coping mechanism. What the best proposition can do is a bleak feeling of resignation, which isn't really quite happiness at all. But when you're faced with material hardships, that like the best people can manage is a dull sense of acceptance. But what hope provides on our side then is it provides you with a sense of happiness in and of itself, where it makes you feel like your life has meaning. But it also makes it easier to cope with short-term hardships because you think it's going to pay off in the end, where you think it's going to matter in the end, and therefore this makes it easier to cope in the short term as well. No thanks. Third, we think it also leads to self-discovery, to discover the passions that Prof wants to talk about. Or by virtue of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, you also having new experiences which allow you to discover new passions. You can discover small things that bring you joy. Or perhaps you join a debate club to try and get into a prestigious university, but even if you don't get into that university, you can discover a passion for public speaking, which is a more accessible way of bringing you joy in the first place. But also, I think you experience more failure, which allows for you to do things like self-reflect and develop emotional maturity, which makes it easier to deal with inevitable failure that comes with on either side of the house. You get character growth that you uniquely get when you push yourself out of your comfort zone. Fourth, I think you also get better relationships and more relationships under our side of the house, where on proposition, most people are complacent with the cards they've been dealt. And in the real world, this often translates to things like being complacent in your workplace and in your job, being complacent in the physical space you live, where you remain in your physical community and you never branch out. On our side of the house, you expand your reach out of your local community, where you do things like look for better job offers, where you move to try and apply for internships, where you take initiative to reach out to people you otherwise wouldn't have talked to on proposition, because on our side, you reach out to them to learn more about a company, which will make new connections, people you otherwise would not have talked to on proposition. What this means is you're exposed to a greater amount of people to form more friendships and relationships. And this is incredibly important because interpersonal relationships are often that which makes us happy, which gives us the motivation to keep living. They can offer us comfort and solace when we face inevitable hardship, when important people in our lives pass away, that they can help us cope with grief. It's just broadly beneficial to meet more people and to not simply be relegated to these small local communities that you will be on proposition side of the house. But the final thing I want to note is that the happiness you derive from success is relatively accessible, where people can find success from things like short-term milestones or small achievements along the way. We can often find intrinsic fulfillment from personal growth. We can be proud of yourself for reaching new heights that you otherwise would not have reached in things that are meaningful to you, instead of being resigned to the state in which your state of competence on proposition. But finally, even if you don't succeed in these specific goals you pursue, like these specific jobs or the specific subjects you want to pursue, I still think you develop cross-transferable skills along the way, where perhaps you don't get the job working at Google, but you develop things like important communication skills and marketing skills that can benefit you in other places. This is another mechanism for why your material conditions are more likely to improve in an accessible way under our side of the house. We give people financial security, we give people happiness and hope. Proud to oppose.
Great, thank you for that speech. For that, I would like to call upon the second proposition speaker. Yeah.
Is it okay if I really quickly go to the bathroom?
Yep.
Thank you. We think for the millions of workers living in China who have to push their limits, continuously work overtime, and have no time for themselves or for their families, enough is enough. We have to draw a limit here and prove to you why exactly on their house, with the structural things and the structural changes that they want to make are simply inachievable for a simple Chinese worker to go up to megabyte of a corporation and say, stop, enough is enough. That's probably unlikely to happen. I have a few things I want to do in this speech. First, we talk about the framing and recontextualizing this debate. First, we talk about fighting to improve conditions and fulfillment. And then lastly, talk about success. But firstly, a clarification of this debate. I think they try to push us to stand in opposition argument about complacency, which is that, these minorities are going to feel complacent and then they're going to endure structural oppression. I think firstly, the narrative is on a spectrum and it's based off of ability, right? It's exactly why hyperproductivity and consumerism don't harm as many poor people who literally cannot opt in. We think the same thing applies here. We think that these poor people or people who are so structurally disincentivized probably will not think that these philosophies will opt into either, or at least often do it on a spectrum. Similarly, the worst won't apply here as well, right? Most of the lying down movement was from corporate China. So people who had a job, who had an ability to move up in the ranks, that's where this debate is mostly centered towards. But even if they did, it's still worse. And this leads me to my second question about fighting to improve conditions, right? I think that firstly, we tell you how their point about reducing oppression, right? I think firstly, everybody is stuck in the violent wheel of hyperculturalism. When they say that the rich people and the people at the top will continue to oppress them, we already preempted this in our first speaker. We told you that people by default will oppress each other less when they don't care anymore about wealth or improving. That means that you don't cut down on worker abuses. When you cut down on worker abuses, because you simply don't care about making as much profit anymore. We don't expand your corporation to infringe on other people's autonomy and their rights when you don't care about expanding and doing as much anymore. Poor people are already treated better when the society doesn't really care about pushing them down more in order to boost themselves up. So we already improved poor people on that condition. But secondly, poor people can never change the scenario. I think that this is just a sad truth, but it is a truth in of itself, right? We gave you a lot of reasons why exactly hope is easily washed out. That's why exactly on There's the House, when you evaluate poor people based on their own standard of how much they've done or how much they've accomplished. Disillusionment is very popular, right? Poor people feel disillusioned with society. They don't even go out to vote because they feel like they're too busy. They have better things to do. That's exactly why hope on their side is a one-side thing. But secondly, what does exist is hyper-consumerism. So hope can be washed away very easily, which already has been done. But hyper-consumerism and societal narratives will always exist. So even if you're not the poorest of the poor, even if you are disadvantaged, you will still feel like this hyper-consumerist narrative pushing down on you, which means that comparison will always happen. So things like people wanting to change a scenario and not wanting to do so because firstly, there are a lot of structurations. Like the structures that you want to change are far too big and people do not have the hope to overcome this and they do not have the power to do so. But secondly, the structural oppression on Here's the House will always exist, given that hyper-consumerism will always exist, will always happen and will always exist. And so the people at the top can always exert their power to squash these people and squash their changes. They gave us no mechanism as to why having hope from these people who are at the very lowest of the low will actually change anything on There's House. Therefore, the question then becomes, why is comparison so bad on There's House? And we tell you, regardless of your standard, regardless of where you lie in society, you will always compare yourself to each other due to the narrative's hyper-consumerism. So that means that even if you get a promotion, somebody got two. Even if you got a raise in your job, somebody got even more of a raise, and that will always quash how much happiness you feel. That's exactly why on There's a House, you're unable to even access the very bare minimum of happiness from what you are doing and what you have done, because somebody will always do it better than you, right? That's why exactly on There's a House, insatisfaction will always happen. You never do enough. And that's why their arguments about success and how much you feel like you've accomplished something when you look back are simply not true, given the standard of society, which is that you must do more, you need to do more. And that's why exactly this movement began in the first place, when corporations kept on abusing their people and saying that you need to do more. And they finally said, enough is enough, I'm stopping this, right? So you cannot self-reflect. We think that at the end of this, they're putting out self-reflection just falls out. Because when you're always so forced to do as much as possible, when people are always doing more than you, and they point to you and go, hey, you can do this. Why aren't you doing this enough? Why aren't you doing as much? Then people are never going to self-reflect. They're just going to keep on pushing themselves more and more, and they have no time in the end to focus on their hobbies or even focus on their friends, when all they're garnered towards is this hyper-consumerist nature, which forces you to do as much as possible. Lastly, I want to talk about why even if people don't fight, they get more happiness on our house. This is not the worst side, like the worst case of our scenario, which is that poor people don't fight, or people who are oppressed or have bad scenarios in their own hands will not fight, and that's when you don't get structural change. I meant firstly, we reject traditional forms of happiness, and thus wealth, societal beliefs don't affect you, right? So we think that arguing that these structures will never change on our house, given that they have no mechanism, is enough to realize that the narratives that we use to base our lives on our worth is simply incomparable, and we should not rely on it any longer. That you yourself are the comfort and the solace that you need, and you always have a constant form of happiness and appreciation to come from when you lie flat, when you appreciate what life is for you for the moment, and you don't understand, and you don't really feel any attachment to things that can easily be left away in the blink of an eye. That's why exactly on our house, people feel more happiness, because they realize that they recognize that there's a stability in their life that they will always get, that they are the controller of their lives, and what they cannot or cannot do, it doesn't matter to them anymore. They can rely on other things like family, like their art and their own pursuits. And even if they still have a job, it doesn't really matter how much of a wage they get, which is arbitrary in the most certain. And that's why they get more happiness on our house. Well, lastly, I just want to really drive home that why success is not ending. So even if people are not the fullest extent of happiness, why this full constant success of happiness, standard of happiness, is still better than what they have, which is just like a wave of happiness on their side. So not having fluctuations in happiness is probably going to be very bad for the mental health. As we told you in our first speaker, when you lose a mother or when you lose a family member, these things heavily impact you, given as to how much benefit or how much happiness you derive from these people. So when a mother dies, you feel more crippled because for months and months and years you cannot do anything, because you feel like you've lost them, and therefore your happiness is gone. That's exactly why success on their side of the house can easily be washed away, because you have simply no other alternative to go to and no other reason to gain happiness, because you bank so much of your happiness on them. Yes, I'll take that POI.
So if your first argument is true that there's less oppression because there's less incentives to try and get more money, then why are there systemic inequalities that make it harder for poor people to actually get success?
Yes, but these systemic inequalities are ultimately created by someone, right? The people at the top now feel like they don't have to have these things anymore because they don't have to oppress people in order to gain happiness for themselves. But even if these systemic things still happen, you have to prove to why you saw them on your side house. On our side house, we say that's fine. We don't need to solve them. As long as the poor people feel happy, as long as the poor people feel happy at the very end of the day, we believe that they fulfilled their life purpose and they had the best life that they possibly had. You cannot get that on your side house. Lastly, then moving on to the argument about why exactly you get why we help minorities. So this is even more of a clash as to why exactly we win over opposition. Firstly, even if you get like minorities to do things, or even if we don't want them to do anything, we shift the blame on helping minorities and the burden onto other people in society, right? The government will still have overwhelming incentives to help minorities, probably because they don't want to burst themselves anymore, and this will still exist on our side of the house too. We actually think it's more likely for the government to help and recognize that minorities can't do everything themselves when minorities have finally said, stop, I'm not going to try anymore, and you can do all you want to help me, but I think that is ultimately your job and not mine. This is principally accurate because we think that minorities ultimately had no chance to be in the situation that they are now. It's unfair to place all the burden, all the narrative of them having to advance themselves forward on themselves and themselves only, which is what's going to happen on their side. So as long as minorities don't feel this burden anymore, they're likely to live a happier life in of themselves. They're not constantly working 24/7 just to get a promotion for their job, or they're not constantly trying to barter and lobby to politicians 24/7 when ultimately they can be waived off in less than a second. So even at the end of this day, minorities get more fulfillment from another avenue, which is that they no longer have the crippling burden of improving their own situations that they themselves had no control with on their side of the house. So ultimately, we prove two things to you. Firstly, success isn't everything, and on their side of the house, success is short-lived and also non-satisfactory on their side. But secondly, that we get better fulfillment from the get-go when these minorities and people who are disadvantaged, or just everybody in society, doesn't have to derive their pleasure from this hyper-consumerist narrative that will never end on their side of the house. For all these reasons and many more, we're very proud to propose.
Great, thank you for that speech. With that, I would like to call upon the second opposition speaker. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, cool. Three things I want to talk about in this speech. First, I want to go over some broad framing that exists within this debate. Secondly, I want to talk about the clash about minorities, why we benefit minorities' lives much more on our side of the house. And lastly, I want to talk about just broadly fulfillment and happiness and which side is able to get more of that in this debate. Firstly, then in terms of broad framing things. Firstly, I know the proposition framing in this debate is incredibly naive and one-sided. They say that they frame this debate about being only about China and the corporate structures that exist within China. But I would observe that this debate probably exists in other aspects as well. So it looks like, for instance, pursuing your long-term passions. And this is different, and this is more nuanced than the description that proposition gives to us, because the proposition idea of the things that you were likely going to pursue were likely going to be short-term things. And this is because the narrative was likely going to be things like do as what you enjoy in the status quo. This looks like, for instance, doing things like playing League of Legends, for instance, if you enjoy that video game, or like, for instance, just like eating junk food if you enjoy doing so, and not looking like things like long-term fulfillment. And the structural reason to believe this is because long-term fulfillment often takes significantly more effort to invest into. So oftentimes, if you want to become a musician and you have an active interest in it, it takes significant amounts of effort to do things like study music in the very, very first place. You oftentimes need things like money in order to do so, and that suggests that people are able to pursue these things much more, and people are able to get fulfillment on our side to a much larger extent. The on-side proposition, you got a baseline level of happiness, and that was not sufficient. Firstly then, in terms of the clash about minorities, the first thing that proposition tells us is this idea that rich people in society no longer feel any reason to oppress minorities anymore. This claim is bizarre because presumably, insofar as this debate isn't necessarily about your material, this debate is about the amount of hard work you put into in order to get to the position you are. So it looks like, for instance, the proposition illustration of grinding incredibly hard to get to where you are in the status quo. Presumably, rich people still prioritize things like money on either side of the house, and this is because money is just generally a prerequisite to a lot of other things. So I'm unclear. So insofar as rich people still get this money and they don't have to put any active hard work anymore, I'm unclear as to how this philosophical belief is going to affect these individuals on any meaningful level. And proposition did not prove prove that there's a link between rich people and this philosophical principle in this debate. This wasn't that these rich people didn't have anything to do in terms of hard work and just wanted things like money on their side of the house. But secondly, I'd observe, even if structural oppression decreased on their side of the house, these minorities' lives still weren't fulfilled to a very significant extent. And the reason to believe this is because, insofar as these people didn't put an active effort into bettering their lives, so for instance, doing things like finding a better job, that was the point at which they probably didn't get significant amounts of fulfillment. And the structural reason to believe this is because oftentimes your happiness and your fulfillment is contingent on things like material good. So for instance, when you as a mother are unable to buy a birthday cake for your young child, that is the point at which you feel significant amounts of pain insofar as you were not able to make the special day of your child happy, and that was the point at which you likely felt significant amounts of pain. And that suggested therefore that even if the structural oppression on side proposition decreased, the individual sense of happiness that these people felt decreased as well on their side of the house, and they were not able to achieve that on their side of the house. Why then was our world likely going to be better? We told you firstly, more people were likely going to be actively willing to do things like incentivized to do things like change on their side, on our side of the house. They say that things like hyper-consumerism are likely going to exist, but presumably you can always do things like go into further amounts. You can always do things like go. They say that you cannot ever benefit your life on their side of the house, but obviously that is empirically untrue. You can always do things like study new degrees in university, do things like work for a higher promotion and things like that. I'm unclear as to why minorities are unable to benefit their lives at all. I'll take you after this theme on their side of the house. But at the end of this theme, it is quite clear why we win on this theme, because even if the structural oppression that existed on side proposition was lesser, the incentive for these minorities to benefit their these poor people to benefit their lives also decreased significantly, and that was the point at which that their lives weren't likely going to be significantly happier. And on our side of the house, we had these benefits of hope, and I'll talk about more on my second theme, but we still have these things on our side of the house. I'll take that PRI before I go to my second theme. Okay, or not. Okay, second theme then, in terms of, okay, yeah, go.
Your claim was that rich people want more money because it's easier to gain it. Why don't we also get minorities to pursue better things like degrees and jobs as well if they're easy on our side, as you characterize?
Because you have to do things like hard work. I talked about this in like the first 30 seconds of my speech. It takes significant amounts of effort and energy to do things like study music if you want to become a musician. And that is why these poor people are disincentivized to do things like take up these passions, whereas it is a different mechanism for rich people. Okay, cool. Second theme then, in terms of fulfillment versus happiness. The first thing I want to talk about is the proposition argumentation. The first thing that they tell us is that people were likely going to feel fulfilled to a much larger extent. There are a few responses to this claim. The first thing to observe is that people derive much more fulfillment on our side of the house. And this is because, think about the vast majority, think about a lot of people who die within society. There are many people who die on their deathbeds, and their only wish is that they had more time to pursue passions that they truly wanted to do within their lifetime. I think that this is probably going to manifest on the proposition side of the house as well. That this is probably a good narrative to live your day-to-day life in terms of making sure that you have some level of happiness. But insofar as that doesn't mean into any form of actual fulfillment for these individuals. That was the point at which these people probably felt a lack of fulfillment within their lives. Secondly, they said you probably didn't feel significant amounts of attachment, and that was something that was going to be good. I would say that it probably isn't, because it meant that you had less fulfillment within your life. So for instance, if you do not feel significant amounts of pain when your mother passes away, that suggests that your bond with your mother wasn't significant enough for you to feel that bond in the very, very first place. And this suggested then that you were likely going to feel incredibly lonely within your life, that you did not have any meaningful friendships within your life that you were able to talk to and have these emotional connections into. Insofar as you did not feel anything when they left you, that suggests that you did not have these things. The impacts of this are quite massive, insofar as many men in like their 40s and 50s feel significant amounts of loneliness, depression results from this, and that was probably something that was not incredibly good. We thought that having these emotional ties were likely going to be better, even if you felt pain when these people left you. Secondly, though, we thought that people were able to change the success paradigms on our side of the house. So even if people are unsuccessful on our side of the house, they were still able to derive things like fulfillment in other mechanisms. So for instance, even if I didn't make Team Canada, I can still derive fulfillment from my debating career, from being a successful debating coach, and watch my juniors prosper as individual debaters. And that suggested that even if people were incapable of succeeding within one area, they were uniquely able to switch this field into going into another area that was similar and helping them prosper in that area. And the reason why this was incredibly likely is because people already have an emotional attachment within this activity, and that was the point at which they felt fulfillment through other mechanisms. And so this suggests that our mechanism of fulfillment wasn't contingent on their idea of success existing, but they were not able to provide fulfillment for these individuals on their side of the house. Why then is our argumentation matter significantly more than theirs in terms of fulfillment versus happiness? We told you there are many reasons as to why you were able to feel much more fulfillment. We told you, for instance, you were able to do things like discover new passions. You were able to make new friendships that you were not able to make on the side proposition. And I would assert that the way we define a fulfilling life in society is in terms of how much experience you go through within your life. Insofar as you were able to explore many different things on our side of the house to a sufficient extent and did not give up at the smallest burdens, that was the point at which you felt significant amount of fulfillment on our side of the house. Why then did fulfillment matter significantly more than happiness in this debate? Firstly, I think that there are like a lot of thought experiments to illustrate this. We think that our relationships in the status quo are much more meaningful than the ones we had as a child, even if the ones that we had as a child were much more happy insofar as there was less things to worry about, because we thought that we had much more emotionally engaging discussions in the status quo and we derived much more meaning from that, and that suggests that we preferred our relationships currently than the ones we had as a child. But secondly, I observe that insofar as you asked individuals whether or not they wanted to live in a simulation where their entire life would be happy, most people would prefer not to do so insofar as they did not get any more form of meaningful fulfillment from that. So the end point of this then is that people prioritize things like fulfillment within their lives, and we're uniquely able to provide this for individuals, and that matters significantly more than the broad level of happiness that proposition was able to provide. We're so proud to oppose.
Great, thank you for that speech. For that, I would like to call upon the third proposition speaker. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep, you are.
Okay. Today's hyper-competitive work culture of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week subjects people to be pawns in their capitalist society. We give people life meaning on RSA House so proud to propose. I want to address two clashes. Firstly, how individuals live more fulfilling lives on our side. Secondly, on how we better help vulnerable groups. First clash then, on giving people more meaningful lives. The first claim to get from their state house is that people are able to pursue the most meaning and maximize their own potential when they're able to step out of their own comfort zone, make friendships, pursue all these things, which may be difficult at first, but it will be really prosperous at the very end of the day per their characterization. Response one, I would like to point out the very new frame coming from their state house, in which it's like society's definition of success is dependent on the amount of experiences that you actually get. We don't think it's really true. We think it's mostly in a hyper-competitive culture because of capitalism. But even if it is, we think you still have individuals trying to pursue it, something to maximum extent, in which you don't really get a lot of content within the thing you have now, constantly want to pursue even more. This means that all the fluffy stuff they want to talk about, for example, friendships, they probably aren't the ones that are going to be glorified on their state house, in which are not really conducive to success. That's why burnout still will happen on their state house. But response two, even if we despite that characterization, we think constantly making more friends and there's no end goal. We probably think that individuals, they probably can't find a balance between this. The reason for that is individuals that constantly want to pursue for a better life. This means even if you make a lot of friends, we think you'll want to continuously make even more. It's really hard for individuals to live in the moment because they're afraid to lose out on other things that are going to be more beneficial to that. Thirdly, I just want to weigh your frame against regret. For example, on how when you are passing away, you aren't able to pursue the most meaningful in life. That's why at the end of your life, you'll actually regret a lot of these things. I think I have three mechanisms of weighing. The first mechanism is that we think a lot of people, you probably wouldn't regret something that actually they never really wanted in the first place. That is to say, on their state house, the societal narrative essentially tells you what you actually want. So that's why you regret in the very first place. On our side, we actually flip that, and we also allow people to pursue their own meaning. Second weighing then, we think the meaning of life, even if they do achieve on their state house and people they don't regret, we think that they can't actually pursue much of what they enjoy. Because even if you are hanging out with your friends, you constantly have in the back of your mind that I'm not maximizing this to my potential and all of that. For response three though, we think even if there's regret on our state house, it probably isn't that bad. The reason why is because you can reflect on how meaningful your life was when you pursued your passions, and it wasn't just on a lot of society's standards on you. Because even if you have hanging out with your friends, you still have society standards on how you should actually treat your friends or what that relationship should be like. We're also able to step away from societal judgment. The next thing that gives to us was on how there's a lot of material comfort, on how it actually better allows you to pursue your passions, and they try to call out our case. Response one, also note that we also are able to get material comfort on our side, in which individuals are still able to live a stable life. One thing on their state house, what it essentially looks like is promotion after promotion, and you can't really access your passion. They just told us why individuals are able to stop on their state house because people essentially want to pursue even more and even more. Even if you're content, society tells you that you must pursue even more. So we think they aren't able to get that on their state house. Response 2 then, we actually think there's certain things that you can't put away till the long term that you must get done in your youth. I think this directly bites in the frame where DLO said you regret on your deathbed, because there's certain things, for example, spending time with a family member, you can't really do that when family member has passed away, and also spending time doing a lot of like rigorous activities. We think they aren't able to have a lot of passion on their state house. But under this clash, I would just like to bring back our second argument about coping loss, on how it's so intense that you regret you could have spent more time with your mother. The response in DLO was that if you don't regret it, it probably means that your bond wasn't that significant in the first place. Response 1, notice that it's a coping mechanism on our state house. Within on their side, you just ruminate on how you should have changed, or how you should have treated your mother better. We think it's going to be all encompassing that regret. We're able to allow individuals to actually move on. But secondly, we think they refuted the example, then refute the analysis in which we told you that individuals, when they can't change something, they constantly regret it. We're able to change that on our state house. I think the conclusion of the clash is simple. On our side, individuals be able to live more meaningful lives, and they don't have to opt in societal like structure of what they should be. We have under argument 2, which never refuted anyways. We also told you on why individuals are going to be judged by society, in which you must do certain things, on how you're going to be seen as weird. We're able to change a lot of the societal narratives on our side of the house. Before I move on, are there any points?
Sure. So are minorities able to access hope, which is necessary to buy into your analysis about why you're going to always be like improving yourself, or are they going to be disillusioned?
Firstly, we think individuals, they still try to have a sense of happiness and want to pursue their passions. On our side, we think individuals, they have it inherent, try to possibly do so and also fulfill their own passions. But even if that wasn't true, we think on your side, you actually push individuals to the extreme. They aren't able to enjoy themselves, even if they're disillusioned. I want to talk about our second clash then, on how exactly we better help these vulnerable groups. And this was probably like the most weighing that they tried to actually push in this round. It's their path to victory, essentially. So they take it down, they essentially do this round. The first clash they give us, the first point that they give us on how a lot of these vulnerable groups, they probably wouldn't try to uplift themselves, and how it's really detrimental because you aren't able to actually pass social movements and get people to join and also take down a lot of these oppressive structures. Couple responses towards this. I think firstly, Sophia and also Jonathan gave you unique analysis as to why a lot of these structures, they probably can't be changed, in which it's a lot of societal structural oppression, in which it's called structural because there's just certain things that you can't really change. But even if you can, we think it takes such a long time. A lot of individuals, they can't really enjoy their lives. They're going to be constantly ruminating, what could I do? Because essentially on their state house, society would push the blame on them to try to get them to actually change their livelihoods themselves. I asked them a POI, never really give us a response. Why is it likely counterfactual? I think the first reason why is because when you try to when you constantly tell individuals to pursue better lives, it probably means that you expect people to actually constantly work and also make their lives even better. That's why the poor will actually be even more disenfranchised, because they have the extra burden to try to uplift a lot of societal structures. That's why the rich will never help them on their state house. I think the second reason why is because the rich could just justify that on how a lot of these people are probably lazy because they haven't been doing enough. We think it gets even worse on your state house. Conversely, when you shift the societal narrative, telling individuals that there's certain things that can't be changed, sure, we think maybe individuals, they probably wouldn't be as good at financial standing, but at least they're content with their lives. They don't have to face a lot of discrimination comparatively on their side. But under this clash, I'll just like to bring back our second substantive argument, which we also never responded to, in which you have less of a dog-eat-dog world, in which people, they constantly take away one another's jobs because there's zero-sum resources. But I think on their side, they also said, the rich don't need to actually work that hard to oppress other people. We just don't think that's true. We think that it actually decreases a lot of the harms that we do get on our state house. Because what happens is, if you want to constantly take other success away and also constantly push your own success, we're probably going to be shamed by society when you are harming the minorities even more. So on our state house, it probably does mean the minorities will be harmed to that great of extent. What's the way on this clash then? We think firstly, for vulnerable groups, even if we don't actually uplift them on our state house, we think at least we give them a content life in which they aren't forced and they don't have to live under expectation that need to change their lives themselves. Because we think even society doesn't shame them, they themselves will try to think, how do I actually take down a lot of these structures? We think it pushes a lot of extra blame on them, at least they're able to live in a content life. But I think the second way in here is that we think on our state house, on RTA House, we're able to get a lot of societal narratives that do help the poor and also a lot of these vulnerable groups. I think this directly flips a lot of the analysis in which we tell you that individuals, they probably would do get shamed when they are also attacking other people, because under a second standard argument, and we told you the metric of success isn't just to take away other people's jobs. For all these reasons, we think even if they do win on societal movement, it takes far too long, and they're in a process individual lives that have wasted a large majority of it. We think at least we give the vulnerable groups the life that they truly deserve. At the end of the day, I'm so proud to propose.
Great, thank you for that speech. For that, I would like to call upon the third opposition speaker. Yeah.
All right. I prefer like POIs where you raise your hand.
Third opposition speaker, I think that your voice is a little breaking. It's lagging.
Oh, is this better?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll try and speak louder. So I prefer POIs where you raise your hand. Lying flat is an ideology that traps people in a suffocating feeling of despair. When you buy into the ideology of lying flat, you're essentially surrendering your autonomy and ability to decide the final trajectory of your life. You leave your fate to the hands of uncontrollable and completely arbitrary factors that are outside of your control. You become no more but a puppet who is bound to live, accept, and be complacent with a script that was already predetermined and pre-written for you. We argue that this is a condition where people have no autonomy, is one in which that is terrifying and hopeless, and for that very reason, we're so proud to oppose this motion. Two themes in this debate, firstly on the impacts to social change, and secondly on the impacts on the individual. Firstly then on social change. First off, under this theme, I want to clarify what this motion is really about, because clearly proposition misunderstood it. This motion isn't about how people will interpret this ideology and in which circumstances they will rationally apply it. If it was, then this motion would instead be worded, this house supports the dominant narrative of lying flat, but it isn't. The motion is simply this house supports lying flat, where we are asked to directly assess the literal principles of lying flat as an ideology in a vacuum, not how people will likely interpret this if it was a narrative in real life. So proposition's sneak attempt at trying to outframe the extreme circumstances of poverty or injustice doesn't stand in this debate. They can't just try and co-opt our points and say, people won't lie flat in extreme circumstances, because it is in their burden to defend this philosophy as it is, not how people will rationally apply if they were in a narrative motion. The strategic implication of this is that the impacts that we gave you about achieving social change cannot coexist with this ideology of lying flat, and they still stand strong exclusively on our side of the house. I'll talk about this more in the future, in the later parts of my speech, as to why it is likely that you'll achieve those impacts in the very first place. But I think that clarifies the issue from the proposition side of trying to co-opt our arguments and like proving exclusivity. Let's move on then to talk about the impacts on the individual. There's a couple of sub-themes I want to explore in this larger theme. Firstly, let's talk about hope. Proposition's largest argument here is that people will feel disillusioned because it is impossible for poor people to change their circumstances. A couple of responses here. Firstly, yes, it is unlikely they'll be incredibly rich, but just because they don't achieve insane amounts of wealth doesn't mean that they'll be disappointed. This is because people generally set goals that they believe are somewhat achievable and reasonable based on their specific circumstances. No one living on the streets right now will expect to become Jeff Bezos in the next year or two. So it is unlikely they'll be incredibly disappointed by the goals that they set, because it is likely that they'll be able to achieve their personal goals, given that they have incentives and reasons to set those goals to be achievable in the very first place. But also secondly, note that the vast majority of people do have the capacity to change their conditions. Yes, they're in a more vulnerable state. Yes, they are often oppressed, but it's still possible that their conditions can practically improve if they personally work for it, or even if they work as a body unified towards that specific cause. Proposition is lying through their teeth if they think that all poor people are eternally doomed to never be able to even marginally improve their lives, no matter what they do. We believe that poor people generally have huge amounts of potential, but often cannot unleash that potential because they don't have the hope that it is possible that they can achieve something in the very first place. Well, even if you don't buy that, there are certain individuals in society that likely do have potential that can be unleashed if they did have that hope. We achieve that exclusive benefit that they do not assess on their side. But also, Elizabeth gives you practical reasons for why their circumstances will likely improve if they have a hope to work to it to begin with. For example, even if I don't speak top speak Harvard WSDC, working to become the top speaker means that I will have to go through the processes that essentially means that I will become a better debater in that process. This is a mechanism that was completely unengaged with and ignored through the proposition side of the House. And the impact of this is crucial because we prove to you that your circumstances tangibly get better. And this is an incredibly important impact because I want to weigh this against worst case scenario on side proposition, where you essentially are just disillusioned. Firstly, we already proved to you why it's unlikely that you'll be disillusioned just because people generally set goals based on their personal limitations. But also secondly, even in the worst case that you are disillusioned, there are still many side benefits of pursuing your dreams in the very first place that you would likely never have access on their side of the house. Like the thing like you're able to get fulfillment from the fact that you're progressing and getting better than you were yesterday, or even the fact that you don't have to live the rest of your life on your deathbed, regretting your life choices because you had the fear that you can't unleash that potential. On our side of the house, the benefits of hope is larger and more likely to accrue than the worst case scenario of disillusionment on their side of the house. Furthermore, it is unclear what the actual impacts of disillusionment is. They just give you very abstract language as to what that likely means to people's lives, which we suppose isn't that like large of an impact considering that they're already on like the worst circumstances that they can't possibly be in. Before I move on to the theme of blame, I'll take the POI.
It has taken decades for people to try to overcome structural oppression without any hope. Why would any individual on your state house be able to cope with that and also achieve a better life?
Literally, like the first part of your POI literally indicates and concedes that it has been possible historically speaking. So people have achieved change and they were able to achieve that change because they had the hope, which literally does not accrue on your side of the house. At least we get tangible change that is already impact that outweighs your little abstract argument about disillusionment, which already occurs in the status quo where they're living in like incredibly oppressive circumstances. Let's move on then to the argument about blame. Proposition tells you that people will blame themselves if they don't succeed. This argument is essentially a wash because we point out you will still blame yourself for not trying on your side, knowing that you could have achieved so much more. On their side, you will still feel the consequences of not pursuing what you want, i.e. for the fact that maybe poor individuals can't feed their children, even if they don't perceive it as something that is harmful, their children are still suffering the physical and biological consequences of starving and feeling hunger. At least on our side of the house, you tried, and even if you don't succeed, at least you conclusively know that it wasn't meant to be yours, and that is so much better than having to live with the fear of not knowing if that success was possible or yours to begin with. But also, I want to tip this theme to our side because if they don't achieve success, we prove to you still get tangible benefits in that process, which already is incredibly beneficial for these individuals. Let's move on then to the theme of family relationships and loss. Proposition's argument here is that people will spend more time with their families if they lie flat. Two responses here. Firstly, this is literally just an assertion. Like it is unclear how they jumped from being complacent with all things in life to getting better family relationships. If anything, the principles of going with the flow as indicated by the info slide is like suggest that you don't want to purposely go out of your way to agitate and pursue family relationships in the very first place. But also secondly, this argument is contradictory and tense with their first speaker's argument about how people are less emotionally attached and thus more able to deal with the loss of someone important to them, because supposedly if you pursue family relationships and like that's tense with being emotionally detached and being able to move on from them easily when they do go to pass away. So at the end of this like theme, family relationships isn't a huge argument for them. It is unclear why that's exclusive to their point either way. But lastly, on a little bit about like work, they argue how like on their side, it's like on our side, it's a dog-eat-dog society where individuals want to push each other down because they want to get higher on the social hierarchy. Like supposedly that exists symmetrically on their side if they're talking about why this is the narrative and that you interpret it, like considering their own like logic, it is likely that people care more about getting higher like ranks or payments from their company in comparison to like abiding by this abstract principle or ideology that likely doesn't benefit them that much in the very first place. But also, secondly speaking, like there are external reasons why people want to get higher on their workforce just because of the fact that they might pay, like get paid more. At the end of the debate, we are so proud to oppose this motion.
Great, thank you for that speech. Our reply here.
Prop's response to our first point is that there's less oppression because people no longer care about getting super rich. But if that is the case, it's unclear why it's impossible for minorities to actually improve their life as they talk about down their bench and why they're going to be disillusioned and hopeless. But they concede in a POI that there probably are still going to be some amounts of systemic inequalities, but there's still going to be some people who are richer who can pass down generational wealth and create systems of inequality. Now, this is problematic for their case because they never prove why the privileged were going to help the poor on their side whenever they talk about how we're pushing the burden onto minorities. But the response we gave that they missed is that the privileged people at the top have no incentives to go out of their way to actually benefit the minorities who they profit off of. Where just because you're complacent with your privilege doesn't mean you're going to go out of your way to rectify inequality. It oftentimes has to be the minorities who advocate for change. So it's exclusively on our side where we agitate for change for things like wealth redistribution or welfare, where people in the future can be born into better material conditions, where they don't have to experience visceral suffering of hunger or sickness, that they can actually access the passions that are meaningful to them. But also, this isn't a narrative motion, so it's not about evaluating, it's about evaluating the value of this ideology, and they have to engage with the burden of complacency that is intrinsic to this idea of like lying flat. And finally then, on the weighing as to why this is beneficial. So perhaps it is true that there will be some people who have to struggle in the short term to fight for their cause. But the difference is that when you change systems, this often creates long-term benefits for everybody else going into the future for the rest of time. The comparatives that you are always eternally suffering on proposition, you don't get this benefits that last into the future. So this is probably the most important point on rectifying society-wide inequalities. But on individual happiness, the main push down prop bench is that people are going to be like consumed with hyper-consumerist pressures, and they're going to compare themselves to everybody else. So this probably firstly concedes that people feel some hope, which is why they're trying to pursue more in life in general, and they aren't disillusioned and giving up. So why then is hope better, and why does this rectify against some insecurities? First, we told us that you probably don't enjoy feeling unhappy, so you try and find happiness that is relatively accessible by turning to your own small achievements to cope and to try and find solace. But second, Hao tells you that people have reasonable expectations, but you have realistic expectations about what you can achieve. Like I can be exposed to people like Jeff Bezos, but it doesn't mean I'm going to be disappointed when I don't grow up to become Jeff Bezos. But the third thing we told you is that whether or not you do succeed, the hope for self-improvement makes you happy in the short run. Where on proposition side, the best they can achieve is a sense of resignation, where we can actively give people a sense of happiness, where they feel like their life has purpose, where they can do things like daydream about success, which helps them cope with the capitalistic pressures that they characterize on their side. What then was our case? We told you about why you can improve your material opportunities, where you do have some capacity to improve your life, where studying in school obviously gives you more opportunities than not studying in school. But the second thing we told you was that even if you don't become a CEO because it's extremely competitive, as proposition tells you, you still develop cross-transferable skills in things like marketing or communication that give you some opportunities compared to not trying at all. So given that we can better your material opportunities, why is this more important than the content that they give you? First, material opportunities allow you to access other forms of happiness. We need to have basic things like life and shelter and healthcare to be able to access any other things that they want to talk about on their side. But secondly, we flipped this from the very beginning. When he said when you had financial opportunities, you had more abilities to access your passions, where you had the financial opportunity to pursue things like art schools or frivolous things that you otherwise would not have the finances to pursue on proposition. But you can do things like perhaps take your family on a vacation to bond if you so chose to do so. But the final thing we told you in terms of flipping passions is that people oftentimes don't discover their passions on proposition because they're complacent in the first place. Our third mechanism under our second point was the fact that when you try and push yourself out of your comfort zone, like perhaps doing debate for university, you discover passions along the way, like passions for public speaking. And this allows people to find other smaller ways of achieving happiness, like passions that you uniquely get under our side of the house. For all these reasons, people are happier under our side, they're healthier, we're very proud to oppose.
Rip, thank you for that speech. Last speaker of the House, proper reply. Yeah.
We think that at the very end of this debate, we still left with no mechanisms as to why poor people will be able to change their fate at all on their sides. All benefits that they have fall out the window. Because when they push social movements and when they push success, it's very, very hard to believe them when they say that it's very, very hard for people to even move up the social ladder. That there are other things that they can at least like have a whole entire social movement that will take down a literal corporate hegemon. I find it very hard to believe in the absence of any mechanism as to why the poor people who already have so little to work with are going to be able to have overtake these things or make actual social movements change. Look at the status quo, given with how little they have and how much hope they have on their house. But I want to make a second clarification, is that people still do what they like. I think the sneaky shift in third opposition was to literally compare us and misconstrue us to having us die of hunger and having our children die of hunger. Obviously not. If this is about fulfillment and what makes us have the most fulfillment, if the people who are at the very bottom of the bottom are probably going to have the most fulfillment by, staying alive, right? So that's exactly why on their house, they cannot just keep on misconstruing us to letting our people suffer and letting us starve, because these things probably also bring us fulfillment and we're probably going to do them on both sides of the house. So realizing that you can still be fulfilled, even if you don't need to get into Team Canada, proves that individuals do get happiness, not by large achievements, and that can happen on our house. But I want to move on to the first question then about fulfillment. This is the largest part of this debate because we rely on this debate to be judged upon happiness. Even if they get success on traditional means of life, if these individuals are not happy, we can win this debate because they would benefit them the most. But firstly, we want to point to you that you cannot choose, you cannot control life. A lot of these things about the vicissitudes are not structural issues, but rather things up to chance, up to fate, and things that you cannot control. Success and hope are reliant on one another, which is why on their side, they have no hope. When they cannot prove success, when these individuals cannot move up the social ladder, they easily get disillusioned, look to workers in the Rust Belt, etc. But secondly, individuals feel happier on net on our house, regardless of where you are in the social ladder, right? We think that happiness fluctuates on their house. Well, you gave you reasons why happiness will be quashed by comparison, right? So any happiness that they get will be dumbed down because firstly, you're always willing to do better due to the hyper-competitive nature on their house, which they never actually reply to. But secondly, you feel guilty and regret that you didn't do it much. So we flip the regretting point, that you regret that you didn't work enough because you can see always people on the other side of the spectrum who are doing much more than you. But thirdly, your loss weighs over gain because you're materialistically affected by these things. So if you lose something that you really like, that you previously were attached to, you can get a coping mechanism that's much better. Notably, they try to misconstrue us by saying that you didn't like these in the first place. No, lying flat is appreciating things when they exist, but letting them go when they do not exist for you anymore. Just like how I can be attached to a dog, but understand and accept that one day they will die, but still love them regardless. But secondly, on their side of the house, regret doesn't individuals rely on our side, individuals rely on stable fulfillment, right? We can appreciate relationships, but cannot cope and aren't fractured. This is the coping mechanism. But secondly, you aren't abused by the literal system. And this was a push that we gave to you at first that they never responded to. When corporations will abuse you and you're always willing to do more and more and never taking any rest, this is what happened in China. That's why people are being abused. That's why when you opt out of the system and the traditional ways of success in life, you're much more able to find internal happiness as to what you want to do. If debating makes you happy and you're not in Team Canada, that's what we can also get on our side. If you want to paint, you can paint on our side of the house as well. Their flip was that, you can paint later on in life. But we told you why this isn't true. Because when you're always competing to do better, when you always feel like you aren't doing enough, you'll forget painting, you'll forget poetry. You're just going to work as hard as you want in your corporate little hole, in your hamster home, and you're never going to get any of the things that you actually like. But secondly, their entirety of the flip knifes their GLO argument. If minorities could act and improve their scenarios easily, then that takes down their whole point of why exactly rich people won't act as well. If rich people can easily oppress minority people, then they probably won't do this on our side house, given that they don't want to opt into the easy thing as well. So we think on our side house, this is the second thing that they didn't respond to. Poor people are less abused by the top because even if they aren't actively helping them, which is their push in their op reply, which is new by the way, they're not going to go out of their way to hurt these people, which is that they're probably going to oppress them less, have less abusive working hours because they don't prioritize their own wealth when they have to put them down at the expense of others. So poor people actually get more happiness. But at the end of the debate, we went on happiness because they can prove traditional successes as much as possible, but many people will never feel content enough. But they will feel content enough is knowing that they are the controller of their lives and whatever happens, and that's how they can deal with it the best. For all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Great. Thank you for that speech and thank you for the debate, everyone. I wish you all the best for the results. I would request the adjudicators to please come to breakout room number 5 for deliberation. Thank you, everyone.